After an uneventful Virgin Flight VS300 to Delhi, we checked into the swanky Claridge's Hotel and spent most of the afternoon on its lawn, eating Indian delight, drinking coffee and feeding the local variant of squirrels, which come right up to the tables. As the sun set, we took a stroll around the area near the hotel. This is clearly a wealthy part of town, but even its posh white houses are overrun with monkeys. Our local tour guide, Anil, is a dryly witty sort of a guy with great powers of description. He's also quite critical of India, saying that the British devised the roundabouts all over New Delhi, but the locals have never quite grasped how to use them. Nevertheless, he says the Indian government has preserved the roundabouts because they like to keep the people going round in never-ending circles. Our first official stop of the day was at a Muslim mosque, the Jama Masjid. All of the ladies in our group had to change into all-encompassing, all-covering dresses, which went right down to the ground. The Jama Masjid temple was indeed very beautiful, the architecture quite lovely, but as I've found time and again on holidays, there's really nothing quite like photographs of local people and their lovely children to really evoke the character of any location. Impressive though the architecture was, I more enjoyed walking through the streets nearby to get there. That sense of teeming millions and abject poverty becomes very real. We saw dozens of stray dogs and bikes piled high with clothing for sale. We were waved at with evident enthusiasm by a busload of schoolgirls who turned up carrying musical instruments and pennants and flags to take part in a Sikh religious celebration of some sort. At almost every step along the way, people were trying to sell us things. Postcards, books, drinks, Indian jewels of the stick-on kind, stamps, model elephants, model tuk-tuks, and delicious street food sold from upturned crates and oil drums on the edge of the pavement. We boarded the bus again to head for the impressive Red Fort, a Delhi landmark which really should not be missed. After walking so long in the subcontinental heat, we thoroughly enjoyed our lunch in the Broadway Hotel, where our table turned out to be a recycled four-poster double bed. Our last visit of the day was to a Mughal tomb, by far the most beautiful sight of our itinerary so far. Anil seemed to take particular delight in pointing out that one of the less ostentatious tombs in the grounds was thought to be the resting place of the Lord's favourite mistress, much like today, he said, explaining that there is no name on the tomb, but she was provided for even in death. Today, they just get clothes, limos and jewels. Nothing really changes.
Not sure.
May I have your attention, please?
Setting off at 5 a.m. the next morning, Carl and I split off from the main touring party to board the Shatabdi Express, heading for Kalka and a train called the Himalayan Queen, sometimes known as the toy train. It's not very comfortable, but it is definitely one of the most spectacular train journeys in the world. Getting to Shimla required crawling at 20 kilometers per hour into the Himalayas, And for much of that time, Carol and I chatted to a Hindu couple who had just become married 2 days earlier. They were going to Shimla on their honeymoon for 4 days. The bride's hands and feet were beautifully covered in henna designs, part of the marriage ritual, and she wore a necklace which seemed to stand in place of a wedding ring. A small girl from an Indian family at the far end of the carriage kept popping over to see us. She also leaned out of the window and screamed at the top of her lungs every time the train passed under a tunnel, of which there are 104 on the route up to Shimla. There's also something over 800 bridges along the way, which offered us the most spectacular views we have ever seen. At Shimla, slightly sore of bum, we got out to find the air thin and pure. Carol had her photograph taken with a local celebrity, an ancient porter who has worked in the station for over 60 years and showed almost no sign of slowing down. A fleet of jeeps whizzed us to the Hotel Oberoi Cecil, another joy to behold, and the first hotel we've encountered where the bedrooms display a notice saying not to feed the monkeys. Before arriving in Shimla, we saw quite a few pictures which depicted it as a lovely little English-style village in the middle of the Himalayas. But it wasn't really. There are millions of people living here. The town was apparently once just a small village named Shamla, in honour of an Indian goddess. But when the British took over, somehow they changed the name to Shimla. The small English village centre of Shimla was the home of the British government during the summer. Our Indian guides have terrifically good English, but there are odd occasions when the pronunciation leads to mishearings. We were told that we were about to go to visit the Wife-Stricken Lodge, which turned out to be the Vice-Regal Lodge. This rather splendid old building had been the administrative home of the British government. A gigantic, bright orange statue of the monkey god Hanuman looms over Shimla. So on the 22nd of November, we started the day with a hair-raising jeep ride along dusty, twisting roads into the Himalayas to see Hanuman. His temple is appropriately overrun with monkeys.
And according to that story, it is said that when Lord Rama, he was in the forest for a 14-year exile. During that exile, wife of Lord Rama, she was abducted by the demon king.
Our convoy of white jeeps then sped us off to Mashobra. A huge bird, which we were assured was a Himalayan griffin, soared above us as we walked along the ridge at Mashobra, from which the panoramic views of the Himalaya mountains were quite breathtaking. We had lunch that day at the Woodville Palace, an extraordinary hotel which felt like a trip back into the 1930s. There were tiger heads and yak heads on the walls, and much of the decor had a kind of Art Deco feeling. Carol says that if we ever come back, she'd like to stay in the Woodville Palace. After lunch, we returned to Shimla for a stroll along the Lower Bazaar, which was fascinating. The range of what seemed to us very odd little shops crammed into tiny spaces was quite extraordinary. I particularly remember a barber shop with 2 chairs. It was about the size of 2 telephone boxes side by side. Another outstanding feature of the Lower Bazaar was the astounding range of exotic vegetables and fruit on offer, a great many of which were completely unidentifiable to us. And although ours were the only white faces in the whole length of the bazaar, we never once felt at all threatened. In fact, many people smiled and said hello to us. One elderly gent even stood up directly opposite me, stamped his foot and saluted. I returned the gesture and we went happily on our separate ways. On November 23rd, we took the toy train back down to New Delhi so that we could switch over to the Palace on Wheels. It's much grander, much more comfortable than the toy train was, but it feels so much more distant from the people of India.
We are now in Jaipur, about to go and visit a temple.
It was quite a beautiful modern temple, but the thing I remember most was that as I came out, I stepped into a huge pile of cow dung and had to make a death-defying road crossing to find a puddle in which to clean my shoes. We went directly from the temple to the Albert Hall Museum. Again, it was jam-packed with splendid artefacts, paintings, statues, but what I remember best was seeing a couple of snake charmers outside charming snakes. A much more memorable outing took us to the Jantar Mantar Observatory. It was not at all what I had expected. All of the astronomical instruments were huge stone or marble structures set into the ground in an area which looked as much like a modern sculpture garden as it did a scientific institute. There was a huge sundial, maybe 30 feet high, with steps up to the top, which was just fabulous.
There are 5,000 people are still living here, so now we are in township area of the fort. On your right and left you can see the building.
Our expedition to the Ranthambore National Park started very early in the morning with a 6 a.m. rise. The park, overlooked by a 10th century clifftop fortress, is famed for its tigers, of which we saw none at all. But we did see crocodiles, several species of deer and monkeys, and a host of beautiful birds, including one which perched on the railings of our truck and ate bits of banana from the hands of Raymond, one of our fellow travellers.
This palace was built by Bappa Rawal in 8th century, means about 1200 years old. But it was also destroyed by the Sultan of Delhi when he conquered the Fort Tipargarh. Then again it was rebuilt by Maharaja Fateh Singh in 19th century, so now in modern century. Hello!
He was a legendary founder of Sun dynasty ruler of the Chittorgarh. So 8th to 16th century, in the mid of 800 years, all the kings they used to live here, so this was principal palace of the rulers. Normally you have in the two part of the palace known as a Jannana and Mardana.
Our third day on the Palace on Wheels took us to a huge fort at Chittorgarh, said to be the oldest and biggest in all of Asia. We were stunned because we'd never heard of this place at all, but it was quite the most marvellous thing we'd seen so far in India. Carol bought a card for 10 rupees from a child in the fort at Chittorgarh, and it was by far our most satisfying purchase of the trip so far. Our tour guide pointed out that the people who sell trinkets and gewgaws at the major tourist sites are often working for local shops. But the children at Chittorgarh, however, had made these cards themselves, so any money we spent would go directly to them. Our next stop was at the Taj Lake Palace, a beautiful white hotel on a lake. It is perhaps most famous to James Bond fans for its appearances in the film Octopussy. The garden known as Sahilion Ki Bari in Udaipur was a welcome diversion, a wonderful change from the endless round of palaces and temples. I have to confess that there were times on this trip when our trots through museums and palaces one after the other just became a blur of jade pots, ancient swords and rifles. They were all diverting for a few moments of ooh and ah, but ultimately I couldn't take it all in. These gardens, however, were an unalloyed delight. The Amber Fort at Jaipur was also quite spectacular, starting with an elephant ride up the sloping road to the fort itself. As we swayed from side to side, we were harassed relentlessly by hawkers trying to sell us calendars, tourist books, tiny elephant carvings, photographs of ourselves on the elephant, and much more. We were particularly intrigued to see a gate adorned with vicious long spikes designed to stop elephants trying to attack the palace. The interior of the fort was magnificent, with huge towering walls, courtyards, sunken gardens and turrets. We lunched in a lavish restaurant at the very top of the fort, but I was now starting to suffer with what I believe they called Delhi belly, even though we were no longer in Delhi. So Carol acquired a pill from our tour guide Jeff, and that helped put me back to normal. Around dusk in Jaipur, we heard some lovely Mezuin singing from a high, slender minaret, lit up at the top by rings of tiny lights. I have a particularly vivid memory of stopping briefly by a lakeside to gawp at the fabulous Jal Mahal Palace on the Mansagar Lake. We lunched that day in a 5-star restaurant in an opulent hotel, but unfortunately I can't remember its name. The next day found us at Gadsisar Lake. This is an artificial lake, believe it or not, studded yet again with beautiful shrines to Hindu gods and goddesses. It was a very brief bus ride from the serenity of the lake to the town of Jaisalmer itself. After strolling round the town, we headed for the Sam Sand Dunes, which we did on the backs of camels. Camel riding, let me say right now, is something no one ever needs to experience. It is genital achingly painful. It felt not unlike a ride along Blackpool Beach, except that the sun was shining and there was a lot more noise. When night fell over the Sam Sand Dunes, we were treated to what was described as a cultural experience. To me, it looked like a combination of the hokey cokey with the conga by way of a cowboy barn dance.
Here in the city of Jodhpur, they paint their houses blue.
During breakfast on the train, there was much speculation about the fact that the going rate for hiring an assassin or a hitman in Jodhpur is just about 1,000 rupees. We also learned that our train has a carriage up front, occupied by a complement of 10 soldiers armed with semi-automatic rifles. Palace on Wheels kept very quiet about this, and the soldiers have kept such a low profile that we didn't even realise they were there. India, it appears, is a more dangerous place than we had believed it to be. And an exotic train full of well-off Westerners could be a prime target for outlaws or terrorists. I think it was somewhere around this part of the journey that Carol and I were treated to or terrorised by a journey in a tuk-tuk. In case you don't already know, a tuk-tuk is a three-wheeled, cheap and cheerful motor vehicle used as a taxi throughout much of Asia. Carol and I used tuk-tuks on many an occasion, but in Jodhpur we had a downhill tuk-tuk ride that was so exciting it would have made a perfect sequence in any of the Fast and Furious movies. We zoomed down a very steep hill, avoiding cows, donkeys, goats and other tuk-tuks until we arrived, miraculously, safe at the bottom. We rose before dawn the next morning to visit the Ghana Bird Sanctuary, where the sounds around us were like a CD of the bird noises of the world. We saw egrets, storks, kingfishers, spoonbills, owls, snakebirds, a sarus crane, and at the very end of the ride, a pair of jackals right by the roadside.
This is downtown Amritsar.
Carol and I broke away from our Palace on Wheels touring party to visit Amritsar, which is on the border between India and Pakistan. At the fabulously beautiful Golden Temple in Amritsar, free food is given out daily to thousands of hungry people. From there, however, it's only a short journey up to the Amritsar border. Where we watched the ceremonial opening and closing of the border gates. A truly unique and bizarre attraction. effectively a ritualistic war which allows both nations to express their nationalistic fervour while soldiers parade up and down as if they're being paid by the Ministry of Silly Walks. The final day of our Indian journey, of course, took us to the Taj Mahal. I don't think either Carol or I anticipated quite how lovely that building is. It is exactly as it appears to be in photos, a large domed white mausoleum flanked by 4 elegant towers, but neither photographs nor descriptions do the place justice. And of course, being big dog fans, we were delighted to find lots of our canine buddies hanging around the Taj Mahal.